Hey everyone, Anne-Marie here again today. Hey Kayleen, hope you've got your favourite beverage with you. We are going to dive into some of the things that we spoke about over the last number of workshops. There may be some questions that you have. Always happy to answer those as well. But I know for some of you this week has been busy, you've been working, and this is a great opportunity for you to catch up. And one of the things that I've said along the way is it actually is part of what I know to be true for myself, but also share with clients, is that I talk about layered learning. And that is, you might hear something over and over again, and all of a sudden it has deeper meaning, it clicks, that saying, the penny drops. And that's because there are some certain things that you've had to understand first before something really makes an impact. And so hopefully there'll be some layered learning today. So like always, let's dive in. It is Saturday here in Australia, and so yeah, got some things to do, some mum tasks. Okay, so today is a catch-up call. If you're not familiar with what we're doing and all of a sudden I'm randomly showing up in your feed, this week I've been doing my online intensive, which is talking all about profitable podcasting. And today I'm taking some of the highlights and some of the key learnings that I want you to take away with you, especially if you're A, thinking of starting a podcast, or B, you've got a podcast and it's not really generating the results that you want. My name's Anne-Marie Cross. As I mentioned, I'm also known as the podcasting queen. I've been podcasting since 2008. Before, that was back in the day when people go, what's a podcast? I don't even think we called it a podcast back then, to be honest. I think it was called online radio with those platforms. But my background really is very much in personal branding, online marketing, communications. And now, of course, I'm able to integrate podcast strategy on top of that as well. So if you're here today, and I've mentioned this in previous workshops that we've had as part of this intensive, and even in the work that I do, this is not a podcasting course where you learn the technology and what you need. I mean, that's certainly an aspect, but I talk about the 90-10 rule, 90% strategy. If you're here as a business owner, but specifically as a service-based business, and that's what I was, a service-based business leveraging podcasting, making all of the mistakes and then some, to get to a point where I could start leveraging and integrating my podcast strategy as a core component of the way that I build my reach, build my reputation, and ultimately build my revenue. And you would have heard me share, and I'm going to share briefly around how I was able to, we were able, when I started my first podcast, to build influence and to build impact, but we struggled with income. And there were a number of reasons why that's very important, especially if you're a service-based business and you're looking at, leveraging your podcast and not just having, that's fine. If you want to have a hobby podcast and want to share your message, great. But if you're wanting it for business growth, then this is for you. So in the workshop one, we covered some of the mistakes and the mistruths. And these were things that I started to recognize because I always look at a number of different key components when you're looking at marketing. You've got to think of, and I talked about niching, and I talked about the behaviors, consumer behaviors, things that happen from a market perspective and from a global perspective. Other things can impact. We are sitting in the middle of a pandemic, and so that is going to impact the psyche of your ideal customer. It may, for some of you, lengthen the buyer's journey. It may require you to be even more proactive in what you're sharing. So all of these different factors impact how you share your message, and because it's impacting the know, like, and trust. So anyway, let's talk about the podcasting profit or progress pyramid. We talked about, where are you? Stage 1 is where you're just starting out. Stage 5 is where you've got everything covered. You've got the reach, you've got your reputation, and you've got revenue. And in between that, there were the different stages. And I find that some people are either in stage 1 and they've got lots of ideas and possibilities that they can leverage for their podcast, but they don't actually ever launch one. Others, they go, you know what, I'm going to launch a podcast, and they record episodes and then it just sits there on their computer. Some they'll launch and then it'll start becoming inconsistent. They may not generate the results that they want, and then it kind of trickles out. There's a term for that. I didn't create this term, but it's a term that people use, and it's called pod fade. And that's where eventually the podcast stops. Stage 4 is where my colleague and I sat for many years in our first co-hosted podcast, and where I sat for many years too, as I kind of figured out, how do I leverage this incredible platform? And of course, stage 5 is where, when you incorporate the things that I'm going to talk about today, you'll start to see some really great results. Now, again, we're talking about business growth, not just podcasting in this aspect, but I find with a lot of my clients, you've got a body of knowledge and expertise and ability to really transform and support their ideal customer, but they feel invisible, and it's frustrating. They're trying to do all of the things, but it's just not making the impact that they want. But what I often find then is that the next stage, this is the 5 pillars of success, you've got to gain insight on the right aspects for your business, your ideal client, your unique offerings, a lot of other different things in that area. However, when businesses think, yeah, I've got that covered. Yeah, I know who my ideal client is. Yeah, I know what their needs are. Yes, I know what I'm offering. When you actually start to see and hear and watch their content, it's not building intrigue. I'm talking about the type of content that someone will, scroll through their feed or listen to a podcast introduction and then go, oh, I think I need to listen to this, or I need to read that. That's the kind of content that you want to continue to create, especially if you want to build your reputation as a trusted authority, the person to go to, or one of the people. There can be many aspects or people that are a trusted authority in your industry, because I'm a firm believer there is so much business out there, and there's going to be an experience that you create, which is very different to an experience that, say, one of your other colleagues or creates in your business. I remember in the career industry, some of my closest friends and colleagues were what you might think are my competitors, but they had a different style, they had a different approach, and that was fine. And some of us ended up doing collaborations, and it was a lot of fun. And that was very much working with people in my industry that from the outside you could have assumed that we were competitors. So but anyway, you have to build intrigue. Then what often happens when you're thinking about a business is, because we're trying to do so many things across different platforms, and all of a sudden a marketing person says, well, you need to do what's the latest TikTok, and then you need to do this and that. What we aim to think, oh, I don't want to miss out. Well, maybe that's the golden, the silver bullet to help me build my business. But we end up stretching ourselves way too thin. It's not integrated. So you have to integrate it with good systems, solid foundations, so that you know that as you're building momentum, that momentum can continue. That is the biggest challenge, I think, for businesses, is building the momentum from scratch. And if you've got to build that momentum over and over again, no wonder you get burnt out, right? So when you integrate it well and things are moving, and some things you'll have to go back to and tweak and change, that's just part of business. You might launch something and that didn't work very well, part of business too. But eventually you'll continue to notice things that are working, strategies that you implement, and you think, well, that worked really well, I've got to do some more of that. And then you start to build the influence and ultimately the income that many of you are looking for. So in workshop 1, we talked about the podcasting mistruths and mistakes. And I asked you, why do you want to start a podcast? So go ahead, even if you're watching the replay, let me know, what are some of the reasons why you're wanting to start a podcast? And while you're here, let me know too where you are in the world, where you're listening and watching from. And even in the replay, put #replay, let me know. I go back and I look at all of the comments. So some of the concerns that I have heard over the years may very well be the concerns that you have. Don't know where to start. Technology confuses me. Don't have a big list to help me launch my podcast. Don't have time to even start or commit to an ongoing podcast. Is it worth it? Will I get the results? Now, all of those specific questions have specific answers that are specific to you, obviously. I always say to people, the only rule in podcasting is there are no rules other than the rules rules you set yourself. What determines the rules determines the purpose of your overall podcast, the commitment that you have. Podcasting is not like radio. Podcasting is, far more, if you do it well and strategically, you can really build a solid relationship and use it as part of your nurturing sequence and your pipeline. And you don't have to have an ongoing podcast if you don't want to. You can do it very strategically and maybe have seasons. So be mindful of that too as you're thinking about your podcast and overall strategy. As I mentioned, I started my first podcast in 2008. We did that after the global financial crisis hit around the world. I was in the career industry, and the doom and gloom that mainstream media portrayed, just to get the headlines, those tacky headlines, just to scare and cause fear in others. We could see that was impacting the psyche of our customers and potential customers. We knew things were tough. I mean, we certainly didn't discredit that. There were difficulties, and we knew that people had to change their approach to job search. And they had to do that quickly. And so we started Career Success Radio, and we produced that and really impacted the world, or around the world, our ideal customers, and also the people that we met along the way as far as our guests. But we struggled to monetize it, as I mentioned in workshop 1. We hired mentors, but without success. So even though we implemented great strategy, people loved our content, and we built influence, we built impact, we just struggled to build income. So here are some of the things that I learned, and why for you, I want you to just to be mindful, because often we think that and this is what I thought, that I assumed people would hear me, they would hear what we shared on their podcast, and then they would think, oh, I'm going to go off and I'm going to hire Anne-Marie, or go to her website. And that's certainly not the case. Hey, Sasha. Hey, Rogers. Great to see you here. So I assumed that people would be impressed with, my qualifications. I was a multi-award winning personal brand strategist in resume writing. I had authored Ace That Interview because I thought, people had been telling me, write a book, and you'd be seen, you'll just be catapulted and build your business that way. And I thought, well, if I integrate a podcast at the same time, that will really elevate. But again, we didn't have the right strategy. I was a board member of the Resume Certification Committee. I was an annual judge in the Resume Tory Awards, contributing author to dozens of books and articles all over the web, and still struggled to generate clients from the podcast. And of course, fast forward 12 years. Actually, what are we now? August. Yeah, August, September is when we first started back in 2008. Interviewed, over 1,000 guests, multiple podcasts. My current one is Industry Thought Leader Podcast, CEO of Industry Thought Leader Academy, Ambitious Entrepreneur Network. And so over the years, I've learned a lot, which is really what I want to share with you today. And one of the questions that was asked, and I mentioned already, was what is the ROI? What can I expect to achieve? Yes, there is time and commitment in setting up the right foundations. But for me, it is absolutely worth it. For clients that I've worked with, absolutely worth it as well. And there's some other people who are really using their podcasts strategically as part of their business growth and their marketing and relationship building. So for me personally, I've had speaking opportunities on global summits with other multi-6 and 7-figure business experts. My digital footprint caught the attention of Microsoft Australia, and my digital footprint really was built on a lot of the social media strategy that I had in place, and that was based very much too on my podcasts. Just a number of months ago, one of my colleagues was part of a Tony Robbins Business Growth Blueprint, and he said, you'll never guess who they're featuring as part of the program and how to get in front of influential podcasters. And there was my face on their screen. You never know where your voice will end up. My voice also ended up syndicated on national and international radio. I'm over in Zimbabwe and the other side of Australia here. You never know where your voice ends up and who you will get to inspire. Brand awareness, internal and external sponsorships, but there's a strategy around that, and of course clients. And the biggest lesson that I learned was when I started Women in Leadership podcast. where I was only 3 episodes in and was able to generate clients just from 3 episodes. And it was at that time that I thought, I wonder if I could do this intentionally over and over if I backtracked and documented all of the steps. And of course, that's what I'm sharing with you today through the trial and error that I have learned. So you don't need to make the same mistakes. Now, here are the 3 mistruths. Number 1, your microphone or technology will make the difference in having a successful podcast. It won't. You have to be clear on your message. That's why I have that hashtag message before microphone, because you cannot edit and mix compelling content that converts and that nurtures listeners into leads and ultimately paying customers, even if it was recorded on a most expensive microphone, because you can't edit and mix compelling content from fluff and banter. Number 2, publish your podcast and clients will come. Yeah, right. No, they won't. Didn't for me. Didn't I? It's like that website analogy where people go, "I launched my website and no one's coming in." Or what about, well, I set up my shop. We had the big welcome sign on the front, but no one's coming in. What's happening? You have to do marketing around that, don't you? And number 3, that I love this one, get listed and new and noteworthy, and your podcast will be a success. Vanity numbers are misleading. So don't be swayed by wanting to be on the new and noteworthy, because I've had people in my community that I know, colleagues who have had very successful from a downloading point of view, millions of downloads, and yet they weren't able to monetize it because they really didn't have a strategy other than to get out there and share their message. And I'm going to share with you my podcasting positioning quadrant, and they would be more what I would call more the celebrity influencers, and not really seen as a trusted authority where people are actually paying money for their expertise. So let's talk about mistake number 1. I have 7 podcasting mistakes and 7 podcasting principles. And the first one I've spoken already about, no clear strategy, and starting a podcast, getting my message out there and blasting it across as many platforms as I can, getting out as many interviews as I can, getting on new and noteworthy as quickly as I can. That's going to be the success of my podcast. Well, it may give you the vanity numbers where you can say, hey, I was listed on new and noteworthy, but it's certainly not going to impact your bottom line. What do you have to do? This is principle number 1. Have the right strategy, which is the end in mind. And a lot of businesses, when I ask them, well, what do you want to do? What's your program pathway in your business? What's your, what's your reputation? I call it reputation equity. What do you want to build and become known as? And as you know, it can take a time and consistent commitment to build that up. A lot of people say, well, I don't know. I don't know. And so this is where you need to really get clear on what are you monetizing as far as your expertise that's unique from what everyone else is doing, as well as what programs are you offering, because then what you can start to do is, seed and lead people through for those people who are ready to make that next step. Can't do that if you don't know where you're heading. And often then we have a look at the core business foundations. Do you have those in place? And often people don't, which is why they're not able to scale their business. You also got to think at what stage of the client journey am I incorporating this particular podcast or podcast episodes? Remember, as I said to you earlier, a podcast is not, don't compare it to radio where you just get all of these people that you're interviewing. You throw in some ads and then hope one of them's your message, and then you hope that someone's going to listen and think, oh, I'm going to go over there. It's not that at all. You think of your podcast as a relationship building tool where you're speaking right into where your ideal customer is struggling, the challenges, and so the solutions that you provide. So if you're focusing on new customers around the awareness stage, it's going to be very different than if you're using your podcast as a retainment, retaining existing clients or upselling to a higher level program. The content and what you include within, and the stories that you include within your podcast episodes are going to be a very, very different. And a lot of people don't think about this. And of course, an integrated strategy is key. Otherwise, you're going to end up burning out. As I mentioned, the 3 stages of business growth, I like to boil things down simply, and I like threes, like odd numbers, 3, 5, 7, great numbers. But the lean stage, leverage stage, and legacy stage. And what I often find people doing is when they're struggling in business, people say, you need to do more marketing. You need more marketing. Now, on the surface, that seems like a strategic thing that you need to do. Need to do more marketing and get my message out. But you're not ready for the leverage stage unless you've got the lean stage in place first, which is your lucrative niche, your signature brand, your signature system, your signature program, your digital asset. If you're looking at that and you're thinking, I don't have anything of those in place, Anne Marie, or maybe I think I might do, then don't fret, because my next core business foundation program, where for 3 months, you and I, another group of awesome change makers, are going to dive deeply into that before you launch your podcast over the top of that. Because if your message, whatever you're doing already, like articles, like blog posts, like graphics, the things that you're sharing on social media now, if you're going to networking events, even online ones, and you're introducing yourself and you're not generating interest from what you're doing already, please, please, please do not put a strategy over the top of that in podcasting, because you're going to get more of what you're already getting, the same. No inquiries and no real lead on to business, because you got to get that right first. You've got to get that lean stage right first, because there's no point, launching a podcast, doing more Facebook lives, or speaking or writing a book. Those kind of things sort out come later, after you know what you're doing is already working. And of course, the legacy stage is more where you've really got systems in place and processes in place. You've got a great team in place. So you, as the business owner, the CEO, can step away and the business still functions. This is where you're really creating that legacy. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of business growth and understanding where you're at. And so, all right, important. So, mistake number 2 was no lucrative niche. My services can help everyone, many, many people. Well, maybe they can, but to be all things to all people, you end up being nothing to no one. And what do I mean by that? Market to the masses and you'll market to no one, because no one is going to resonate with your message. So, principle number 2, podcasting principle number 2, is create fans, not followers. Fans who are passionate advocates, who need your expertise and who resonate with your mission, your values. And you can then develop what I call this committed, highly engaged community of just awesome people who, when they're ready, will enroll in your different programs and certainly reach out to you. And so followers are really where you might have more of that celebrity influencer impact. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not banging that at all. There's certainly been a lucrative market in that aspect. But I know for many of you, you are selling your expertise. You are selling your IP, your your unique steps and systems that you have created, your ideas. And that's very different from when you're looking at market value. I mean, your knowledge is what you're sharing, and that's where you want to create those fans, people who are advocates and love what you do. So mistake number 3 is unclear thought leader at brand and message. And so what often I see happening is that people aren't actually even clear about, well, what do I want to get known as? Is there a real unique area in the marketplace that I can confidently and then with integrity really claim that, look, this is where it's my zone of genius. That's a term what we often heard. I can be this category of one. And often many of you here today who are listening or watching the replay, if you don't know what that is yet, take some time to do some research, some further investigation. And often, I love the way that Steve Jobs has said, when you look backwards, you can connect the dots. Take some time to connect the dots for you, your journey, your challenges overcome, the milestones and the markers. When you identify those that are relevant to your ideal customer because they're struggling through a similar journey and pathway, that you can speak some truth and hope and possibility into that and really claim that and marry that in with your story. That's really important. So when your name's mentioned, what do people say about you? Which leads me to talking about podcasting principle number 3, focus on reputation equity rather than, vanity-based metrics. What's your reputation? Well, for me, my reputation is everything. Not from the point of view that I worry and I'm concerned about people say about me. They can say what they like, but my reputation and the quality of my work and what I stand for, if that is questionable, then to me it's like, well, often, obviously, my actions, interactions, conversations, all of that, what's gone wrong, so we can impact that. When I was doing personal branding, we would often say, your brand is your reputation. It's your promise of expectation. It's your promise of value. And when you do that consistently with excellence and integrity, people will start to talk about you, and in a very nice way. And it's similar across the board. That's the kind of reputation that you want to build, and one of integrity and excellence, especially if you're wanting to build that reputation as a trusted authority. Excellence and integrity, in actual fact, Edelman Trust Barometer have said that the latest studies of globally of what creates trust, and I'm talking about the trust that your ideal client needs to have in you and the services that you offer. The level of trust now is built on excellence and integrity, and they called it, I call it excellence and integrity, but excellence is competence and integrity was to do with, I can't think of it, but to do with ethics. Businesses, are they operating ethically? And so, for some businesses, they're not, and they need to go and rethink their strategy. Okay, mistake number 4, broad range of topics and guests. Why is this not a good thing to have in place? Well, again, it's going to water down your message. And you need to ask yourself, what's that one thing that I want to become known for? Now, many of us, this includes me too, may have different modalities, different topics that we like to talk about. In the career industry, I just didn't do resumes. I just didn't do interview coaching. I just didn't do job search coaching, just didn't do LinkedIn profiles or getting online and building an online profile. Didn't do just one of those. I did all of them and then some. I was always looking to learn. Many of us are avid learners. But what we do need to do is to ensure that that one thing, we have a clear message, and then those components can certainly add value and depth and a level of expertise that no one else can offer, because you've got some really strong expertise and areas that you can draw on to enhance the services and knowledge that you bring to your client. But if you haven't got that umbrella statement, that one thing, then it's going to be really difficult for you to become known as that one thing. So for me in my career industry, again, you focus it on the outcome of your ideal customer and what they want. So for me in the career industry, it was get noticed, get hired, get paid what you're worth. And then through working with people, going through where they were stuck, I could understand or could determine where we needed to start to work on first. And now, of course, with my work with business owners and looking at implementing a podcast strategy, I have a look at what their challenges are to say, you know what, let's start at the beginning. We may not need to really spend too much time on there. Let's get this in place first, those core foundations, and then we really can amplify that and scale that. Rather, strategically, because of the fact that we're doing the right steps at the right time for the right process for where the business is. So this is so important because you could be watering down your message. Principle number 4, invest in refining your message before you invest in a microphone. Please do that first. Do that first. And your message needs to really be on point. It needs to, be so stand out that it will stand out. And so important. I did not do this with my podcast, Ambitious Entrepreneur Show, which is why I shut it down. My message got lost in the noise of my own podcast because, and this was an award-winning podcast and often got mentioned. It was actually the show that got mentioned on the Tony Robbins business course, but it's no longer in production. I may start it up again one day. Who knows? I break my own rules, but it'll certainly be far more niched than it was. I was just interviewing anybody and everyone around business. And sure, it was interesting, but to be honest, I wasn't really generating the results from an income perspective, certainly was influence and impact. Mistake number 5, off-brand podcast creatives, music and voiceover. This is something that so many businesses don't consider either. When I'm talking about brands, personal brand, it is an experience. So you want to create a distinguishable experience and expectation, and your podcast creatives can do that from the font style that you use. And by the way, I am not, and I do not say that I am, a graphic designer, or I'm certainly not an audio or musician or anything like that, because they bring a different level of expertise to that as well. However, what I am and what I do is we identify core values and the experience that you want to create, and then we seek out the creatives that exude that tell that story, that bring that message out. And you can do that by the music that you create or that you select. You don't have to go out and create your own music. We've got musicians that will do that for us. But you can select the type of music that will exude that. Now, for me, I kind of love that bold but inspiring music. So I'll often have some, fast beats in that. And so a lot of my guests for all of my podcasts, they were kind of sitting there, going like this. We didn't see it back in the day when we only had audio, but often I would start, they go, I love that. But you know why? I did that purposefully because I wanted them to feel fantastic. It was bubbly. We started, it was fun, and we hit the ground, on point from right at the beginning of the podcast. And I did that because of the music. Music is just can have that powerful of impact, as well as the person speaking in your intro. Now, this might be you. Like, you wouldn't say, welcome to my podcast today. I mean, that's not inspiring, is it? So anyway, just giving you that example. So I ask you, what consistent experience do you want to create? If you're not able to define what that is, no wonder you're struggling to create that. Mistake number 6, uninspiring show introductions. Those introductions with the waffle and banter where you're thinking, oh, get to the point, get to the point. I once listened to someone answer a question that could have been answered in a simple yes or no. Took them something like over 51 minutes. Now, I wasn't interested in the waffle and banter that was going on, and the segue and the segue, and then the flashbacks and all of that. I was just interested. I'm like, how long is it going to take this dude to answer this question? And I thought to myself, wow, okay, so no banter, no fluff. Please, please, please. What you do need to do, though, principle number 5, is learn some compelling communication techniques that captures and cultivates a highly engaged audience of fans. Now, for some of you, you may be thinking, yeah, but I'm not like that. I've just got a very simple process, and maybe have a little bit of sarcasm in there every now and again, and a little bit dry. Well, you know what? Fantastic. Own it. But then what you want to do is really amplify that, so that people know when they're listening to your show that you will bring that dry sense of humor and that little bit of sarcasm. They'll love that about you, and you'll attract the sort of audience who appreciates that. So whatever style that is right for you, you need to own it, and you need to live that every single time that you have a podcast episode, and also across all other aspects of your communication. You need to be on brand in everything that you do. Okay, and the call to action, this is mistake number 7, ineffective calls to action, actually. And typically they are subscribe to my podcast, leave a rating, give me some feedback. Whilst there's nothing wrong with that, we're talking about business building, aren't we? And using our podcast as a way to nurture the listeners who are your ideal clients, and who are at the stage of their customer journey where they're ready to consider doing business with you, or they consider listening a little bit further to you. So what you need to do for principle 7 is to establish a robust list building strategy and a compelling seed and lead initiatives. Again, one of the things that I help clients create is what I call your irresistible signature giveaway. What does it need to be? Your irresistible signature giveaway. It needs to be irresistible. So much so that clients, or ideal clients, if they're driving along the freeway I've even had people go, I had to pull over on the side of the road. Not that you need to be doing that now, but just remember it when you get home, need to get access to that. That's how compelling it needs to be. It needs to be irresistible. Okay. Workshop number 2, we covered the 3 podcast profit models. And let's dive a little bit deeper into mistake number 1, and that was no clear strategy. I'm going to go quite quickly through some of these because we've already talked about some of the strategy earlier. One of my colleagues, she produced a show for 2 years and she had to stop that publication. And the reason was is she recognized that when she started her podcast, she wasn't really clear on where she wanted to position herself. So she thought, you know what, I'm just going to start my podcast and I'll just do the work behind the scenes and then we'll see where we end up. But then she realized the name of her podcast was not positioning her, and in actual fact was very much off brand and confusing her community. I don't want that to happen for you. Another one of my guests said to me, well, we produced over 100 shows and then finally identified how we were going to leverage that in my business. Please don't get to episode 100 or more, or even episode 50. I mean, goodness, you want to be right off the bat from episode 1, starting to create this beautiful funnel that you're going to have people who are your ideal clients getting off your podcast and onto your list. As I said, we didn't have any clear strategy with my podcast either. From the branding strategy, from the call to action strategy, from the seed and lead strategy, the whole lot. In fact, all of the 7 mistakes that I shared with you, I have made and then some. But what happened was with Women in Leadership podcast, I started that podcast after my worst business failure ever. And by the way, failure is part of an entrepreneur's journey. You haven't failed yet, you're probably not taking risks. And there's, excitement in risk because you can identify, well, that's a great way of not to be able to do that. And all of the ways. So please, if you're sitting there thinking, well, there's a lot of things that I've started and I've never really been able to get off the ground, there could be some golden nuggets and insights into what you've done that's not worked that you can incorporate into your story and your journey. But then something unexpected happened for me. I started Women in Leadership podcast because I thought, I could not, I'm a creative, love creating content, love creating courses and all of that, but I couldn't put 2 words together. And I thought I still need to do something. So I thought, you know what, to get over my grief and my loss and heal, I'm going to go out because I thought I can ask questions. I can still talk. So I thought I'm going to go out and interview other women leaders in corporate and also in business. And I'm going to ask them what they did. And so I started that podcast 3 episodes in and then accidentally got 2 4-figure clients. And that's when I thought if I could backtrack that and did that purposefully and intentionally, imagine what could happen. Could I recreate the success? And these are the models that I identified when I took the time to backtrack that. So firstly, my podcast profit formula are the components that you need to build your authority while go from invisible to influential and profitable. So that's the formula. I'll talk about what that is a little bit more in a moment. We talked about the strategy itself is my podcast framework. Then this is where you take your idea to launch successfully your podcast, but you also use that. I use this all the time. Everything I teach you, I'm sharing now, I use and I teach my clients and for all of the podcasts that I've launched, even when I am creating an episode. Starts off with purpose first. What's the purpose and the reason? What's the call to action? And then all of the other things are planning. Well, what sort of storyline do I need? Do I need to incorporate statistics in that? Do I need to have a case study in that? These sorts of things really matter, especially if you're using them as part of a launch or you're using your podcast as part of, a marketing strategy for something that's coming up. Then model 3 was the process. And so that is the pipeline. And this is where we intentionally integrate our podcast with everything else that we're doing in our business. And we do that because we're wanting to build our reputation as the authority, but also build know, like, and trust across the buyer's journey to nurture those listeners into leads and inquiries and customers. So the components are strategy, tactic, plus you equals the 3 I's: influence, impact, and income. You need to have all of those things in place. So often I find people will either have a strategy and maybe a tactic, and they don't really clear on themselves which is why they're not standing out. Or they may be clear on themselves, don't really have a tactic, but have a kind of a loose, I would say, strategy. So you need all three things in place to really make the impact and the income you want. The strategy is the framework. And as I mentioned, purpose, plan, produce, publish, promote, profit. A lot of people don't spend enough time in the purpose section. What is the purpose of this? I mean, really, what's the purpose of this? And then, of course, the planning, they don't get the right content. They don't maybe get the right content, but they don't have it in the right sequence. Because remember, when you're storytelling, you're taking people on a journey. That's why we start with once upon a time, then we tell the story, we go the end. You don't start a story by going the end and then work all the way up once upon a time. Well, if you're a really good storyteller, you can do all of that and weave some, but they're core components and they're a core, um, yeah, just the framework of what you're actually putting into that and the storytelling. And, the greatest storytellers, sometimes is even in the pause of your story, and so all of these different things make a really big difference when you're planning it in the planning stage. So specificity is key. That's why I asked, what outcome do you want for or from your purpose, a podcast? Here are some things that a number of people have identified. And I'm sharing this because you may not realize that you can use your podcast to do this. Retain customers, educate and upsell customers. Maybe you've got a long customer buyer's journey. What does that mean? Well, for some of you, you might have higher level programs, which means that you've got to nurture those customers through a longer time. And you may also recognize that in your business model, your pathway, that a lower end offering is going to be able to nurture some of those existing customers into a higher level program. So your legacy clients are actually coming from and being nurtured from a lower end product or service. And so what you might find is that your podcast is tapping into that. And so that through a podcast strategy where you'll release podcasts specifically internally for your existing membership or programs, that is going to nurture those people into those legacy customers. So again, this is just some ideas, and so a podcast is not just, hey, I'm going to plug my microphone in, I'm going to talk, I'm going to interview, and off we go. There's strategy behind that. Maybe you've had a change in business and corporate direction. Actually, probably going back, and I missed this opportunity, and I can probably go back and do this with women in leadership and also ambitious entrepreneurship, because women in leadership is kind of in hiatus as well. I had going back, because Insight is a great teacher, I probably could have either taken my existing audience on the journey as I kind of streamlined and really niched my topic. I would have lost some of the audience, but that's okay. But I would have been able to nurture that and share that, the change in the direction and what I'm going to talk about. Or what I'm thinking of doing is going back and releasing one episode. And because people are still finding that, podcast has an evergreen lifespan. And I would say to them, hey, if you're just finding this and you're thinking, where is Anne Marie? Where's another show? I am now over at Industry Thought Leader Podcast, .com. So come on over. If this is you and this is what you're wanting to learn, come on over to that podcast. So it kind of feeds them over to the new podcast. But if you look at a podcast for a business who may be changing leadership, someone is taking over the helm, but they've got an existing podcast, or maybe not even an existing one, starting off, start speaking to your stakeholders and, holistically look at who do we need to speak about or to along the journey to get buy-in, and to get support from our community from a holistic point of view. You can really use a podcast to do that well. Internal communications to deepen staff relationships and build stakeholder morale. Think of the companies who are now having a workforce that have been scattered, that no longer are able to work in person within a business. Can you imagine if the leadership of the team and the teams had a podcast or some sort of audio channel as well, that they could just record something, doesn't have to be long at all, but just speak, just speaks and keep connected to their team. What an absolute, incredible way to continue at building relationships and have that narrative. If you as a business are not taking control of the narrative and influencing that, and there's nothing coming from your communications from the, top down, guess what? Your team will fill in the narrative, and it's not going to look pretty if they're feeding their narrative from what's going on in the press. Just saying. Okay. Yes, Kayleen, I absolutely should do that. Okay. So we talked about purpose, revenue, and monetization. And often people say to me, how do I monetize my podcast through sponsorships and advertising? Well, as a service based business, external sponsorships, whilst that is something that you can do down the track, it's not best to focus on the podcast initially. Monetize your own message before you monetize someone else's. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, if you have a look at mainstream media and how they typically work on number of downloads, how, that's kind of more of the broad aspects. But for a podcast, we know it's a niched audience. And what happens with a niched audience? Far more engaged, if you have the right strategy in place, of course, far more engaged and far more likely to say yes and take action. Whereas a lot of, you think about mainstream media, it's kind of like, well, let's just blast them and hope that a smaller portion of that audience will purchase. And so you might have someone who has been listening to a podcast for a while, and because you've been speaking into their life for some time, you will be able to enroll them in a higher level package, if you've got the right systems and processes in place. And so I think if we look at our podcasts from a mainstream media sponsorship and advertising, we've lost. You don't understand just how powerful a podcast platform can be for your business. So please, please, please don't think that that's how you're going to get clients. In fact, a number of my clients now, and even some of my colleagues, and what we've seen across social media, avid podcast listeners despise ads. That is why we don't listen to radio anymore, because of all the fluff and banter and the ads, ad after ad after ad. You can break rapport with your audience to the point where they're just not interested in listening to you anymore. Okay, workshop 3, we are on the home front, nurturing listeners into leads, inquiries, and customers. People come for the topic, they return for the host if you become a trusted authority. So, what is a trusted authority? This is where I spoke about yesterday, actually, my podcast positioning quadrant. So, if you see here on this diagram, there's 4 quadrants, and on the left-hand side going up, you see audience, and this is up, starting low and going up high. When you have a highly engaged audience versus a low engaged audience. And then if we look down the bottom here, we go from low to high, and this is authority. So audience, authority, and where you sit depends on where you're positioned. So when we start off and we look at an audience that has low engagement and low authority, Kayleen just said, I've run out of ink on 2 biros in your workshop. I love that. Yeah, I know. I know. And as I said, I'm only scratching the surface. So anyway, here you go. So then if it's low audience and then low authority, you're seen as an entertainer. Now, I'm not bagging entertainers. I think that's fantastic. I mean, if you just want to entertain, then entertain to your heart's desire. That's great. I mean, but again, many of you are here because you're service-based businesses who've got a body of knowledge that you want to monetize your expertise. Now, when we go up the scale, so we've got a highly engaged audience, and they're people that, will go and they'll listen and they'll probably consume all of the content, watch or listen. That's when someone is seen then as a celebrity and an influencer. Again, nothing wrong with that. You can certainly advertise and sponsor that way. I mean, when we think of mainstream media, but remember, we want to become known as trusted authorities. Then when we have a look at the expert, this is where the authority is high, but maybe the audience is not yet highly engaged. This is where I'll say to people, well, you might have a specific topic, or you may have a guest that is speaking about a specific topic that someone will come and listen to, and then off they go again. So it's a great piece of content, and then off they go again. It's like reading an article on a website. You'll do a Google search, you'll find a resource, and then you'll read it, and then you bounced off the site. Well, what you don't want to have happen is people come into your podcast episode and then they bounce off. What you do want is to do this. You want to have highly engaged audience and also be seen as that highly trusted authority. How do you build that? Let's have a look. Well, what you do is, because where you rank matters, what you want to do is you want to have these things in place. You want to think about community, you want to think of charisma, and you want to think of content. And trusted authority meets right in the center where all of those cross over together. And so the community that you're building, this is what you need to think about, your lucrative niche. They have to have a common desire or a challenge. They have to feel connected, valued, and understood. And they have to resonate with the culture you're creating. So for some of you, you're thinking, what is the culture that I'm creating? I don't actually even know that. And are you creating how you are bringing across the experience, the words that you're using, the phrases that you use? Are you creating a community where they feel connected? So the content that you're sharing needs to be highly niched and relevant, needs to be seen as innovative and market leading. It needs to be validated, trusted, and highly respected. And charisma, this is really all about you. Remember that the formula, the strategy plus tactic plus you. Well, this is where you really look at, well, what does make me unique as far as your presence? Is it captivating and influencing your ideal client? Now, whether you captivate and influence people with laughter or humor or sarcasm or, whatever, it's unique for you. You have a unique style and presence. So you need to clarify it first so you can continuously and consistently bring it out intentionally. Then you need to cultivate that united purpose and passion. People need to um, almost like, oh, I can't wait. I feel so good when listening to that podcast. I feel so energized, or whatever it is that you're creating. And when you do that, you will influence and inspire others. You really will. It just happens. So then we looked at my podcast profit pipeline model 3, because remember, we're talking about nurturing listeners into leads and paying customers, and there's a process to that. And a lot of people don't consider this. I shared this particular diagram where we recognize that only 55% of people, they're not aware of you, and they may be not even aware that they've got an issue. Don't market to them. 25% are aware, 17% are in decision-making mode, 3% are buying. So that's why you want in your business to have an integrated system. And I create my podcast pipeline and everything feeds into that. And think some things lead out of that. So you can have things going into it, but you can also have things going out of it. What do I mean by that? Well, I use my podcast. Looking, this is one of the other things where I see people doing too as businesses. They have podcast episodes that are in the pipeline that have already recorded, and they kind of release that. And I used to do this too. I used to have a podcast episode that I would record and we may not release till months down the track. Your podcast is part of your marketing strategy. How do you know what really, because you always want to keep the finger on the pulse of your ideal customer and what's going on to create content that's going to support a marketing strategy? Are you launching some different programs coming up? So these are the things that you need to consider. And you can't do that if you haven't thought of the pipeline and you haven't thought of the 3 stages of the buyer's journey: awareness, consideration, decision. I'm not going to go too much into that. Go back to yesterday. If those of you who are only just joining me and thinking, where do I find this? Podcastingwithpurpose.com/intensive. You can get access to all of the workshops and the Q&As. The Q&As, I decided this time around, I wanted to bring some more education into it so that people realize that, when you're building a podcast, it is not just getting a microphone and then releasing all of these episodes. There's real strategy behind that. And I found a book which has done more investigation from, because I love to go out now and get validation from a scientific point of view and studies that have kind of will validate where I'm thinking. I observe things and I think, I wonder if this has kind of been validated. And I found this great book called The Momentum Impact. And I've just done a bit of investigation into it. And it goes to show that, if you're a pioneer and you take the time to build a solid platform, you will be far more successful in the long run than someone who just comes straight out of the gate and just blasts. And that's where a lot of people I find will do podcasts. They'll just get as much content out there across as many platforms as possible, and in the long term, especially if you want to be seen as a trusted authority, does not work. So, podcast profit pipeline, we talked about awareness, consideration, and then decision. And where we use our brand communications wheel, which you could use your podcast, which for the consideration stage, the tactic that we're using is the three-part podcast series, which is very different from your ongoing podcast. The series is very much part of the education where you are showing people some of the areas that where your expertise is wrapped around the challenges that they're facing and why they're facing that. You can go and sign up for my podcast series to see what I'm talking about. There's a whole strategy behind that in the content that I share, annemariecross.com/podcast series. And then, of course, decision stage. What are you having as your call to action? And all very important. And then that works for you 24/7. Some of the things that I do, I mean, speaking, podcast, articles, social media, networking, you need to identify what am I doing as part of my awareness building? And is it integrated? Is it consistent? That's really important. The Thought Leader podcast series, this is where I say to clients, you need to start off your first 3 episodes. In fact, episode 0 and the first 3 episodes is really going to set the stage and create a platform so that when people are hearing your episodes and even when you're marketing and doing other strategies as part of your brand communications wheel, the call to action is for them to get signed up to access your podcast series. There's a whole strategy I teach around that. But what happens is people then who sign up for that, who access that, are people then who've gone, yeah, I want that. I need that. And so you know that they are very much people who you can then start to really speak into and nurture through that relationship building funnel that you've got in place. And then, of course, decision. And this also is very important to identify too, because you've got to understand through the customer buyer's journey aspects of where are my customers or ideal customers, where are they struggling, what is the most urgent for them. And so the content that you share needs to educate them in a way that doesn't overwhelm them. So there's a balance between that as well. Often as experts, we forget where our ideal customers are at, and we want to give them everything that we know. And by doing that, we actually overwhelm people, and an overwhelmed person who becomes even more overwhelmed says no and thinks this is just too hard. Okay, so we are at the end. I've managed to keep it under an hour, which is good. Now, for some of you who are thinking, are you? Please don't be overwhelmed. I'm sharing this because I want you to know some of the things that you don't yet know and actually become excited because you think, man, if I took the time to get clear on some of these things, I get them in place, they are going to work for me because they are. But anyway, come on back on my Monday, which is going to be Sunday afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the US. And we have a party. We've had a bit of a competition going on. And so I've said, and there's still time to join in. All you need to do is go to podcastingwithpurpose.com/intensive, get on over to our community, watch the workshops, add your aha. And it's all in the community where you'll add your aha. And then people will go into the draw to win the scholarship. And the scholarship is of my 90-day idea to launch your podcast. It's a program where we work together from idea right through to launch, week by week by week. And I'm going to share more about the program too on Monday. So for those of you who are interested and you're wanting to be supported in that, that's a really good option for you. I'd love to invite you. Love to work with you if you're my ideal client. I'll share more on Monday. Now, that is the end of the slides, I believe. I've got 2 minutes. Who's got any questions that may like me to answer before we close off? Let me just remove this. Let's go back and have a look at Kayleen says, empower creative seeds and women of faith in ways that integrate faith, balance in their creative directions. Yeah, if that's what you're thinking of doing with your podcast, fantastic. What a great way to be able to do that as well. Anyone else got any questions? Otherwise, I will finish up and we'll see you back here on my Monday, same time. But if you're just joining me across some of the other platforms, podcastingwithpurpose.com / let me see if I've got it here. Here we go. Here it is there. Podcastingwithpurpose.com / intensive. Get signed up for that, and then you'll get access to the other workshops and the Q&As, and you'll be also part of the community of our change makers and aspiring thought leaders. Okay, I don't see any other comments. I'm going to leave it then, and thank you for joining me again today. I hope that I've been able to bring some value into your life through what I've shared. If some of you are sitting there thinking, "My goodness," hey Amber, you are welcome. I don't know, Amber, if you've seen some of the other um, other workshops, but please go back and watch. I'm chuckling because Kayleen has just said very thorough. Thank you from Biro number 3. You are welcome. All right, everyone, I'm just going to take this off here and wish you a blessed Saturday, or for some of you, it's still Friday afternoon. But yeah, I always love to say to my community in the US, I'm calling in from your future, and it is looking amazing. So don't tell anyone I told you that. I'll see you here all again on my Monday, and we'll do our celebration party. And then I'll share a little bit more about my 90-day idea to launch your thought leader podcast, if that's a good opportunity for you to join me on this next round. All right, bye for now.